also works. I would just like to welcome you to this evening on behalf of the convent. The idea for the evening started just over a year ago at a retreat planning committee when one of our sisters, Sister Doreen, said, wouldn't it be nice to have an ecumenical event around the time of the week of prayer for Christian unity? And after that, I got in touch with Philip Hobson, Father Philip, our ecumenical officer, and it took a while to get going, but then we had a meeting with Father Philip and Father Jeffrey, and at that meeting, everything took place, and we decided to invite Dr. Edith Humphrey to come and be our speaker. We originally invited her for the Wednesday, but it didn't work, and I'm glad it didn't, because this is the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul, and it just seems like such a good day to be having this. So I just want to welcome you on behalf of the community and to invite Archbishop Colin Johnson to say a prayer.
Before I say a prayer, I just want to say a word of welcome and greeting to all of you. I remember being part of the group for St. Alban and St. Sergius some 40-some years ago, and coming to the convent then, which was, of course, on Botham Road at that point, and joining with Bishop Henry Hill and others in that early period before I was ordained, and so it's good to be back. I've chosen prayer from the Book of Alternative Services, which finds its place in many other books, but it's a prayer for the church. Let us pray. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably on your whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery. By the effectual working of your providence, carry out in tranquility the plan of your salvation. Let the whole world see and know that things which were cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him through whom all things were made, your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. It's a great honor and privilege for me to introduce both of our guests, speakers this evening. I've known both of them a long time. I count both of them as good friends, and I think we're in for quite a treat this evening as we reflect on someone that I think a lot of us hold near and dear, that is C.S. Lewis and his writings. And when I think of Dr. Edith Humphrey and Dr. John Bowen, I think of people who not only can think and speak and write about C.S. Lewis, but in my life I've met very few people that, like them, embody the spirit of C.S. Lewis, that in their own way, their worldview, their way of thinking, their way of engaging with the work of the church, they really bring C.S. Lewis to life. And that is my prayer, that all of you this evening experience that which I've experienced over many years with both of them. I'll introduce our first speaker. We'll have Dr. Edith Humphrey speak first, and then have a period briefly of questions if you want to respond to her particular talk. And then we'll have Dr. John Bowen speak, and again, a period of questions for him. And at the end, if there's time, we'll have a more general discussion about C.S. Lewis. This is because the talks aren't actually interrelated this evening. It's not one responding to the other, but they are both conversations with C.S. Lewis. That's why we've called the topic this evening, Anglican and Orthodox Conversations with C.S. Lewis. So very briefly, Dr. Edith Humphrey currently holds the position of William Orr Professor of New Testament at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. She's held that since 2002. And prior to being at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, she taught at several colleges and universities in Canada, which is where many of us got to know her. She was the Professor of Scripture at Augustine College in Ottawa from 1997 to 2002, and in her final year there, she served also as the Dean. Prior to all that, she graduated from Victoria University at the University of Toronto, and also received her doctorate from McGill University in Montreal, where she worked with, among other people, Tom Wright, the now retired Bishop of Durham of the Church of England. She's the author of numerous books, too many to mention here, but most specifically, very recently, the book Further Up and Further In, Orthodox Conversations with C.S. Lewis on Scripture and Theology. That was a wonderful thing, a treasure to receive. Many of us who have read it already really are relishing in the way she's brought together the thought of C.S. Lewis with many of the Church Fathers and Orthodox theologians of our modern era. So without any further ado, I would like to invite my friend Edith Humphrey to speak to us.
Saying best what's to be said about the Atonement. Psyche, the name of a woman, P-S-Y-C-H-E, and Orual, O-R-U-A-L, in C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces. Besides the doctrines of the Trinity and the nature of Christ, there's probably no more difficult, profound, or controversial doctrine than that of the Atonement. Lewis, in tackling the disagreement between Christians on this doctrine, said this to the ordinary radio listener of his own day. You can say that Christ died for our sins. You may say that the Father has forgiven us because Christ has done for us what we ought to have done. You may say that we are washed in the blood of the Lamb. You may say that Christ has defeated death. They are all true. If any of them do not appeal to you, leave it alone and get on with the formula that does. And whatever you do, do not start quarreling with other people because they use a different formula from yours. Some have suggested that his comment is a bit too careless, that it removes the necessity for atonement by sacrifice, and refers to this as something that might be let alone. But there are other indications that this is not actually what Lewis meant. Notice that he says of the different approaches to atonement, they are all true. His advice here appears to be pastoral and ecumenical, given with the hope that someone who is put off by the sacrificial imagery will be corrected as he or she enters into worship and into the Eucharist or Holy Communion or the mysteries. For someone of Lewis's disposition, we cannot take simply this brief comment of his as the sum total of all his beliefs about this great miracle of Christ for us. Instead, we must also look to his fiction, his works of fiction, where we see how he grapples with the mysteries and the joys of our faith, and where he presses narrative and mythology into service, believing that they offer intimations of beauty and darkness, of a reality that cannot be plumbed by reason alone. In his magnum opus, Till We Have Faces, the mature Lewis does for adults what he had done for children in the Chronicles of Narnia, spinning an extended tale out of mythological material. Elsewhere, he gives a clear indication of how he understands fairy tale, myth, and fantasy to work. They're helpful, he tells us, in making the author check or correct or hold back the demon of compulsive exposition. Ever been in a sermon that you thought was just a bit too much like that? That is, the writer is constrained or disciplined in a helpful way by the genre of the fairy tale or the myth or the legend. He or she, while writing that kind of tale, cannot become like a verbose commentator of Scripture. Think of Craig Keener, I love him, but think of his 3 volumes on Acts. Or a detailed systematic theologian, think of Karl Barth, who even laughed at himself for the voluminous nature of his writing. No, the fairy tale, the legend, the myth, each has a particular shape and requires a particular focus, a restraint from extra matters on the part of the author who indwells their form or who uses them in his or her own narrative. The biblical author, for example, does not interrupt himself in telling the story of Isaac and Abraham going up Mount Moriah in order to wax eloquent upon Abraham's anxiety or Isaac's self-giving or God's great grace. Yet the story speaks powerfully in its own reserved mode. Similarly, the myth conventionally points us away from ourselves and does not rely on the normal building that the novel does of suspense as it tells its story. It tells its story about something greater than we are, something awesome, not necessarily something suspenseful. Such forms are astonishingly fruitful, believed Lewis, because they don't simply offer us entertainment and enjoyment, though this they do, but they help the author who is dealing with mystery to say best what's to be said, Lewis's own words. And so a luminous story can, I would say, have its cake and eat it too. It can live as a fine work of art, even while it enters by that back door of artistry into the fray of philosophical and theological exploration, tantalizing the reader with an unseen world. Till We Have Faces is a book about mystery, informed by classical mythology and replete with theological and philosophical ideas. The storyline is also enigmatic, no doubt one of the reasons that it was not at first well received. But it was Lewis's own favorite of everything that he's read, that he wrote, and the reasons for that are not mysterious. Because within it, we encounter astonishingly well-rounded characters with whom we empathize and who uncover bits of us that we would prefer not to acknowledge. In this way, the story is a true novel, though with a twist. And that's because the narrative is intricate. It's told by what we could call an unreliable narrator, with colliding and mutually enhancing subplots underneath the main story. It is, in fact, a kind of a reversal tale that surprises us, like the psychological thriller A Dangerous Mind. We are, so to speak, taken in or deceived by the main character's story, how she narrates things, only to go through with her several revolutions of meaning in 4 interconnected but distinct movements. In chapters 1 through 15, we hear about the offering of the younger sister, Psyche. And then in 16 to 19, we hear about Orual, the older sister's queenship. Then we hear about various revealing journeys that Orual goes on for the next 2 chapters. And finally, Orual's visionary revelations come to us in part 2, the final part of the book. But interlaced with the novelesque characters and their surprising story is also Lewis's own invented mythology, cunningly linked to mythologies of our own world. The mythological character of some of the book leads us away from introspection and from psychologizing about ourselves to think about the inevitable experience of humankind in general in connection with the world and in connection with a divine world. And the whole edifice contains subtly constructed windows out into various philosophical and ideological vistas that the learned reader may well immediately recognize, but which have also shaped the worldview of a less educated reader who's unaware of them. With all this going on, novel, myth, philosophy, theology, this is not a book for the faint of heart or the feeble of mind. I wish I had time to trace for you its many themes, and for that please see my book, where I do a lot more with this book. Asceticism, the ascetic life and grace, introspection and repentance, the nature of love, relations between male and female, temptation and spiritual blindness, appearance and reality, reason and mystery. Tonight I only want to highlight 2 of its central difficult topics, atonement and judgment, showing how Lewis addresses these aptly and powerfully, saying what's to be said in the midst of a story that is neither a tedious theological treatise nor simply a work of art that begs to be approved or criticized on aesthetic grounds. So first of all, then, sacrificial atonement. Atonement is the most imposing theme in this book. Lewis stresses it in the 2 interlocking stories of its 2 major characters, the royal daughters Orual and Psyche. The 2 sisters live in a fictitious pagan world that has been influenced partially by classical philosophy. Neither the old pagan ways of her country nor her classical education help Orwell, the eldest, to answer in a satisfying way the problems that she has because of the tragedy and the evil seen all around her in her daily life. She finds herself caught between the high-sounding yet trite reasonableness of philosophy that's been taught to her by a Greek tutor, the Fox, and the deep but dark theology of her native land, where the fertility goddess and her son, the shadow brute, are immortal monsters who must be propitiated. Their wrath has to be turned away. The conflict is made excruciating when her beloved sister Psyche is sacrificed to the brute, according to the religious traditions of Glome, so that rain can be brought on. And she goes willingly, Psyche goes willingly, because she longs for a heavenly world, another world. The heartbroken Orwell, also a little jealous of Psyche's devotion to the gods, is led to an impossible impasse. She doesn't know what to do. Neither the rational nor the pagan worldview fully explains the events in her life or her deepest longings. She knows that she's blindfolded spiritually, that she can't see beyond the darkness, but at the same time she's furiously angry with the gods, and she rages against them. At the same time, she also thinks that there may be a purpose to her complaints, that she might actually be heard as she rages. Meanwhile, while all this is going on internally, she serves as a reliable, self-denying, and strong queen after her father dies. Even we as readers see her dreadful character flaws, we acknowledge that she is a good queen. And we see the disordered state of her love for others, and yet we see that she does care for her people too. After Orwell herself comes to face her own weaknesses, the story comes to a shocking and mysterious conclusion, and I'm only going to give a little spoiler so that you read the book. Not yet, towards the end. Well, I've spoken as if the novel is all about Orwell's self-awareness and about her inner growth, but it's not. We may be surprised to find that the traditionalist Lewis has no qualms about offering female characters as Christ figures. Of course, their gender is dictated both by the Psyche myth that he's using as his source for the story, and also by the biblical as well as the pagan imagery of marrying God or marrying a god. But he could have limited the imagery so that Psyche and Orwell, the two sisters, merely presented types of human beings, pictures of the human soul pursuing the romantic and the ascetic lifestyle. Instead, Psyche's messianic function is almost immediately discernible, especially by the Western reader. She is the sacrifice upon the tree. She is the blessed and the cursed, the beautiful one given up for many, the one who voluntarily goes to death, giving up her life that she may save it and the life of others who are looking for the rain. From the get-go, we are enticed to love Psyche through the eyes of her sister and their tutor, the Fox. A little bit from the book. In 1 hour, as Psyche's born as a baby, I passed into the beginning of all my joys. You would have thought she made bright all the corner of the room in which she lay. She slept. Tiny was the sound of her breathing. As I gazed at her, the fox came in on tiptoe and looked over my shoulder. Now, by all the gods, he whispered, old fool that I am, I could almost believe that there really is divine blood in your family. Helen herself, newly hatched, must have looked so. As the fox delighted to say, she was, according to nature, what every woman and even everything ought to have been and meant to be, but missed by some trip of chance. So she's the blessed and the beloved, loving all manner of brutes, winning the heart of everyone, well, nearly everyone, who meets her, and eventually she's believed to have healing powers of touch among the people of the land. Like Jesus, she is betrayed by one of her own, the third sister, Rediville. She is rejected as the accursed by those who had just called her blessed the week before, and she's selected by the priests as the necessary offering fit to die for the people. The initial story about her is told with exquisite timing, a powerful foreboding mood, and Lewis's deft use of Christian echoes. For hours, quoting from Lewis, she touched in healing. I saw her growing paler and paler. Her walk became a stagger. Then, the accursed, she made herself a goddess. And then, that's the holy road, the way they took the blessed. Psyche describes her own ordeal on the tree in paradoxical terms of atonement and rescue. The only thing that did me good was hardly a thought, and very hard to put into words. There was a lot of the fox's philosophy in it, things he says about gods or the divine nature, but mixed up with things the priest said too about the blood and the earth and how sacrifice makes the crops grow. I'm not explaining it very well. It seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me, deeper than the part that sees pictures, deeper than fears and tears. It was shapeless, but you could just hold onto it or just let it hold onto you. Then the change came. I was so thirsty, and at last I saw him. So Psyche is not only a blessed and cursed Christ figure connected with vicarious sacrifice for others, but she's also Isaac, rescued, and she is the soul complete with body awaiting rescue. She is the human beloved, the bride of the God, the favored one who enters into his solid house, the one who is transformed by the divine touch and food. She is the God-seer who, unlike her sister Orwell, has prepared for the ascetic life, for the sight of God, for theosis, for becoming like God her whole life, and she's rewarded. Or, in non-Christian terms, she alone, with her divine blood, can withstand the terrible place where the divinity dwells and where she will be godded. Psyche then evokes the sacrificial story of atonement with which Western Christians are particularly familiar. Yet my selection of passages threatens to render a poignant tale of love, and heartbreak, and transformation a mere vehicle for cultic ideas, whether pagan or Christian. In talking about the book rather than reading it, I cannot convey the bachelor Lewis's, he was a bachelor at this time, uncanny ability to evoke the internal life of his female characters without psychologizing. He's learned well from the masters of storycraft, the spinners of fairy tales who have to heed the restrictions of that genre. And all the women actually in the story, Redeville, Orwell, Bata, and Anset, are not merely representative characters or types. They are both lifelike and iconic, and beside them I think the male characters pale, which is very odd. Though their portraits are an artistic triumph, though, they also speak theologically. Lewis's book is all about the gaining of faces, till we have faces, about becoming a robust human being who can speak face to face with others and with God. And the female characters, especially Orwell, show us this divine progression. Things are even more complicated, though. Lewis is not content to make us, by his story, approve of the Christian doctrine of atonement as though it were self-evidently and incontrovertibly good. In order to show the otherness, the strangeness of the teaching, he contrasts Greek philosophy, which he likens to clear, clean water, over against the pagan mysteries, which he likens to blood. Rational water and mystical blood are also seen in the characters. The learned fox is like the water, giving Greek philosophy. But Psyche's friend Bardia believes in the dark myths of gloom. For the teacher, the fox, the gods are not jealous of human beauty, as all of the stories of Venus or Aphrodite show her to be. They don't intrude into the ways of humankind, and they are unmoved by sacrifice. And so the fox blends the kind of old Stoic ideas of the pagan, of the classical world, with the Epicurean idea that heaven and earth are blocked off from one another. And he offers Orwell a way of seeing the world that dismisses the atonement and everything that it might entail. There's no relationship between the divine and human worlds, he says. But for Bardia, it's different. Bardia's world is enchanted. For him, the dark goddess Ungit and her son shadow brute are fearful, for the devouring and the marrying are one. No water for him, but blood and wine. So these two confidants of the queen, they offer different explanations of what had happened to Psyche. And in doing this, they actually embody, I think, the apostles' words that the gospel is folly to the Greek and scandal to the Jew. For the fox, the sacrifice of Psyche is folly. For Bardia, it is powerful but horrifying. And whichever contrary version of Psyche's adventure Orual adopts in trying to make sense of the mystery, she has a ready-made excuse for disbelieving what Psyche herself says has happened when they meet after Psyche has disappeared just for a moment. Well, Lewis is playing a dangerous game here. After all, the fox's explanation cast doubt not only on the pagan myth of Glome, but on our Christian, and perhaps sometimes too glib, acceptance of a faith that asserts direct and easy understanding of God's ways. We're led to question that. Orual briefly glimpses and hears Psyche's God at one moment in the story, but she's not satisfied because the experience is fleeting, and she's already heard Fox's skeptical explanations. The empathetic reader will readily understand the allure of those kind of reasonable explanations and understand why she dismisses even her own mystical experience. In contrast, Bardia's conviction about the wildness of the shadow brute and the enviousness of Ungit, who's actually Aphrodite in Glome disguise, his conviction draws unwelcome attention to the dark side of any religion that showcases the sacrifice of the perfect human. So the scrupulous Christian may well be repelled, as Orual is herself, by this aspect of the holy. In all of this, we're actually presented three unreliable narrators and not just one. And together they put flesh on Lewis's famous dilemma. Do you remember that Lewis once said that anyone who went around talking and acting like Jesus either had to be a madman or a liar or God? He's pretty well known for that. Well, here, the tension in the story, Psyche, like Christ, is either delusional or she's in league with evil. But here the tension is connected with the problem of sacrifice rather than Jesus' explicit or implicit claims to divinity. It's all about atonement in this story. About the atonement, the difficulty of coming to a decision is acknowledged, and we see it in Orual's struggles. Psyche's sacrifice has either been folly or scandal, unless there is a third alternative. And so Orual argues with herself, and she wants to believe Psyche, but then she ends up not. And Psyche's bliss is destroyed in the end because she tempts her sister to prove that the God exists. Well, we move on to talk about atonement by victory. Psyche's direct atoning path through sacrifice is not the one that's followed by Orual. But in Orual's subsequent life, after Psyche has disappeared, the older sister grows into a kind of a double of Psyche. She enacts atonement through a different means, with a different story. St. Paul himself, in the scriptures, uses more than one picture for the atonement. In Romans 5, for example, he speaks about justification, blood sacrifice, the removal of God's wrath, and reconciliation. Similarly, Lewis adds layers to a narrative that is both human and divine, and he matches Orual's story with that of Psyche's. Orual spends decades in self-denial, wearing a veil to hide her ugly face, learning the craft of war, and studying in a painstaking way. All this comes to a dramatic climax when, just after she has ascended the throne, she has a dramatic experience. She's galvanized to go outside the castle by the sound of moving chains connected to her castle wall. And they come to her ear, and she thinks there's Psyche, who's weeping in the darkness, and she's come back to try to find her sister, but Psyche isn't really there. As she leaves the castle, as she seeks to rescue whoever it is who is weeping, she plunges her hand into the darkness, and she meets the hand of a young man whom she is destined to rescue by means of combat. In the moments leading up to the fight, she plays alternatively the frightened girl and the queen with their face set towards the goal. Just as the young prince asks the question, "Where is your champion?" of the queen. He wants to know who's going to fight for her, and she won't say, "It's me." She's a woman. That echoes the plaintive cry, I think, of Isaac, "Where is the lamb?" And so Orwell underscores the parallel that her life has with her sister's sacrifice. So Psyche, says Lewis, had gone out that day to heal the people, Orwell is speaking. And so she had gone out that other day to be offered to the brute. Perhaps, though, this is what the God meant when he said, "You also shall be Psyche. I also might be an offering in this battle." That was a good, firm thought to lay hold of. And then after the battle, there are parallels and contrasts with Psyche that are drawn as Bardia and the fox run up and they call her "Blessed, blessed Queen, warrior." So the queen's success doesn't only free the young prince, but also, and I can't go into why, delivers her nation from ongoing turmoil and serfdom. At first, this story of victory seems more palatable than the longer, more primitive tale of Psyche. There are many who, since the first publication of a book, very influential book, Christus Victor, by Gustav Alban, there are many who have now championed the so-called Eastern picture of atonement over against the so-called Western emphasis upon sacrifice. That is, they've decided to reject the idea of salvation through sacrifice and replaced it with the idea of Christ, our hero, who rescues us from the darkness. However, to play off Christ's sacrifice against a story of victory does not do justice either to the scriptures or to the richness of the fathers and the liturgies. It seems that Lewis is not going to play this game either. We've already heard Lewis's insistence that many ways of speaking about atonement are true. And it may well be that part of the backstory of Till We Have Faces is Lewis's own discomfiture, his own discomfort with 20th century rationalization of Christianity. And so part of the story, he talks about how a new priest has come in and he takes the old ungut and he replaces it with a beautiful statue of Aphrodite, but how the people don't buy it. They want the old ungut. Well, it's possible that Lewis himself knew about Alban's influence and the trend to turn away from sacrificial language because Alban wrote prior to Lewis. At any rate, Lewis won't allow the reader to simplistically accept Orwell's heroic story as a substitute for the sacrificial story of Psyche, because it too has a shadow, a scandal for any perceptive reader. Orwell does not bask in triumph after her victory, but she enters into the dark night of the soul. She loses hope of ever finding the exiled Psyche. She shuts out the weeping chains, the sound of it, and she embarks on a quest of dying to self. She says, "I'm the queen, I'll kill Orwell too. Kill me." Though desolate, she sets up a kingdom in which many benefit by her self-denial, with the exception of the fox and Bardia, whom she drains dry while she's doing her work. She is paradoxically both the liberty-forging monarch like Solomon in the Bible, and the embodiment of the land globe's rapacious goddess, the spider-like ungut. This revelation of her inner ugliness comes to her in later years. And she has her kingdom in order. She can go on a journey, and her journeys aren't just geographical, they're spiritual as well. There she faces her own darkness, aided in this by a distorted version of her own story that discloses her unacknowledged up until this point envy of Psyche. It wasn't love that made her so angry, it was her envy of Psyche's love of the gods. The third revelatory section of the book gives insight into the dark side of atonement through victory. It's not simply that Orwell is self-centered, but it's also that the actual dying implied in her picture as the victorious hero is arduous. After all, battle is violent. It's just as violent as sacrifice. So just as Lewis doesn't shy away from portraying the shadow boot side, the bloody side of the dominant Western story of salvation, he does not mute the challenge here. Why must holy places be dark places? Orwell asks. Because, it seems, We're in the dark, where atonement by sacrifice or by battle must be accomplished. Orwell's story is meant not only to disclose her own dark soul, which it does, but to disclose also the uncomfortable aspects of divinity seeking humanity, even by means of the victor story. The first part, that comprises the stories of Psyche and Orwell, ends by asserting that the gods have no answer for humankind. But rumors of a partial answer come to the fore in the second part, where Orwell retracts what she has said and gives a supplement. Here she redoubles her quest to trample down death by death. But the story is intricate because also she's the one who's being freed. She's undergoing what she calls the god's surgery. At this point, we're treated to a backstory of Globe's worship and mythology. At the new year, the priest is shut up in the temple at sunset, and then he fights his way out until noon of the next day. In the midst of Orwell's description of this celebration, we're with her inside the cave, and we watch a kind of cameo scene where one of Ungat's devotees worships at the shapeless stone of Ungat and offers a pigeon and is comforted by the spilt blood there. Soon after beholding this act of devotion, Orwell turns her face to the western door, and the noon arrives, and the crowd acclaims the new year, and they cry, "He is born!" It's a celebration that brings even the bitterest enemies together as brothers for the moment. Those of you who are Orthodox may think of some of the prayers during Pascha and Easter. The peasant woman's sacrifice has come together with the cultic victory, and the cave is in the center. The battle of the new year is paralleled by Orwell's own vision, which immediately follows. Here, like the priest, she is dug up in her dream. She is shut up in her dream, and she digs down deeper and deeper and deeper, and she's told by her dead, ghostly father, "Throw yourself down," and she throws herself down again. And then in the lowest regions, she's made to gaze in a mirror, and there she sees the face of Ungat, of death itself. And soon after, she's assaulted by multiple dreams, and at the end of herself, she actually attempts to take her own life, but a divine voice says to her, "No, die before you die." Now, some of these sequences, to be sure, do talk about Orwell's own human nature that needs to be saved, but others of them also talk about the new year being born out of darkness, Christ descending into Hades to grasp the bound and the empty hands that are there. And in the grammar of the book, Orwell's descent into the pit prefigures the final triumphant scene of the book, where divine hands grasp her as she's beside herself, and they both burn and rescue her from herself. She is like Saint Teresa, pierced through and through, unmade and overwhelmed by the gods. So it seems that the scandal of the Christian victor is as great for the contemporary reader, perhaps greater than that of the atoning sacrifice. At one point, we hear that Orwell is not even happy at the idea that the gods may not be bloodthirsty like the shadow brute, that they might become beautiful in some far distant day. And she says to them, "Do you think we mortals will find you gods easier to bear if you're beautiful? I tell you that if that's true, we'll find you 1,000 times worse. You're a tree in whose shadow we can't thrive. We want to be our own." And she also wanted to possess her sister, Psyche. So, like Orwell, the modern Christian may well set aside notions of divine blood drinking and that kind of sacrifice, but still the discomfort remains because God comes for us. He will have us, and that challenges our divine claim to autonomy. We finish with the problem of judgment. The book is really what we could call a theodicy. The question, is God really just? Plagues Orwell from the beginning through to the end. And she's like the psalmist in both 73 and 37, crying out, thinking that God is not there, the gods are not there, they do not care. But she comes to the point at the end where, like Job, she has to ask the question, whom have I in heaven? Whom do I desire on earth but you? The final transformation that occurs with her is surely a divine and not a human act. And yet, the daily run of her life has not been unconnected with the questions of justice. The sweep of the story from her human accusation of the gods, through self-awareness, and finally to her self-judgment, finally ends stunningly in the gods declaring a judgment in favor of Orwell. This is the doing of the God who comes to judge Orwell, but he transforms her as he comes. But it's also bound up with Orwell's efforts and the efforts of Psyche too. And here's where the myth of Cupid and Psyche comes in. Psyche is set by Aphrodite, the jealous Aphrodite, 4 tasks to accomplish. And in her dreams, and there's 2 sets of these, Orwell sees first Psyche trying to accomplish these tasks, and then herself. And in the task, there's a kind of a commingling of actors. Psyche bears her own burden, but she's also mysteriously helped by others, both human and divine. Some phrases from the book. The gods helping her. Oh, great gods, defend her. She was all but unscathed, and another bore almost all the anguish. Justice demands that the task be achieved, but another is offered to take the heat, so to speak. And these tales that are told in 2 vision sequences clarify both the willing and the shocking sacrifice of Psyche on the tree and the lifelong sacrifice of Orwell, a queen for her people. Each needs the other. Orwell comes to see that her love for even her greatest friends has been poisoned by self-love and jealousy. And human life, like human speech and human love, finally at the end takes a proper place in the story and is overcome by the one who is truly real. The dawning of reality is accompanied by the coming of the one, the God who is. And before that face, we're told, questions die away. Orwell, like Job, has nothing more to say for this shining one. When she meets him, the question of God's justice starts to make more sense. She remembers that the fox said, "Are the gods not just?" "Oh no, child, what would become of us if they are?" We need mercy, not judgment. And so God's initiative is stressed all through the story, even while daily human affection, toil, and burdens aren't dismissed as irrelevant. Through intertwined stories, images, and characters, Lewis transcends the common polarity, the common pitting that we do, where we pit off works against grace, or human self-condemnation against divine justice, or mundane experiences over against divine revelation. Had Psyche not gone to the mountain, had Orwell not fought as queen, there'd be no story. Yet, in the end, they are transfigured by someone else, by the Shining One. Together, they give life to the words that Lewis uttered years before he wrote this book. Your new real self will not come when you are looking for it. It will come when you are looking for you, when you are looking for him. Your new real self will not come when you are looking for it. It will come when you are looking for him. Well, as you can see, it's been difficult for me to restrict my discussion to atonement and judgment. Just as difficult as it was for Psyche in one of those tales, in one of those tasks to sort out the seeds. But I do hope that I've conveyed in this talk Lewis's exquisite use of mythology as a kind of a thesaurus for beautiful and dangerous words, as well as a wellspring of images and mystery. His story is inhabiting these terrible themes, yet beautiful themes of atonement and judgment. I'm convinced that Orwell's turning point when she decides she will not believe what her experience has shown her, as she has the mystical experience in Psyche's castle, is in fact replicated by many today who have had such experiences but who doubt their validity, and they recast them as natural phenomena, or they maybe even wonder about their own sanity at that moment. I'm amazed at the way that Lewis uses myth and symbolism to portray characters that are fully rounded, without succumbing to psychologizing or sentimentalization. And he does it for our day. Like in the myth, there was no sense of that the older sisters didn't know that there was no God. You know, it's like they didn't doubt. But for our day, Lewis changes it up a little bit so that Aurora really doubts her own senses. Until we have faces, we're tantalized by the transformed dignity of earth joined to heaven. We hear intimations of a grand finale of our own lives that we could never have imagined. Lewis brings together matters frequently thought incompatible, like different views of the atonement or of faith alongside works. We're beckoned by his story further up and further in, perceiving that the Lord plans to give us faces like his very own, eyes and mouths that are pleased with each other's shining, but so much more wonderful, luminous with the Father's very own glory.
I think we'll allow maybe about 5 or 10 minutes worth of questions directly now for Dr. Edith Humphrey, and then before we move on to the next talk, are there things that you want to ask about this talk or related ideas that maybe have come to your mind?
What do you see as the extension of these ideas into the Great Divorce?
The extension of these ideas into the Great Divorce. Well, the Great Divorce is certainly about judgment, and it certainly is about what we in the Eastern Church would call theosis, about gaining faces, about becoming like Christ. And in the Great Divorce, we have the same kind of tension, I think, that we see in Till We Have Faces, in that Lewis wants to give the hope for transformation. That's the final part. But he also does not want to mute our rebellion, our sinfulness, and our ability to turn against God. And so, Till We Have Faces suggests that if there is a spark there, that it will be blown into a great raging fire. Someone who has even the glimmering of a desire for God, that will be blown up. It will become something lively. And yet Lewis will not go back on what seems to be a very strong theme in scriptures and in the preaching of the gospel, the possibility of turning against God. So at least there's a connection there, and I'm sure there's a good deal more.
Can I just ask, you mentioned Till We Have Faces was poorly received, you know, at the time. Is there a sense in which now, today, it's more meaningful, or we can get it in a deeper way? Because, I mean, if some of you may be familiar with the Charles Taylor thesis about the different eras of secularism, and we've moved kind of from the second, which was about this real clean division between the secular and the sacred, where religion had its place and it was just not in the public square, but we could neatly categorize that in our lives, to this new secular where everything is contestable. We live within a frame where there has been a disenchantment, you referred to that, but that even people of faith are doubting, and people who have no faith are doubting that. And so that the characters there seem so well-rounded and suited to us today. Maybe the book could be better received today. I don't know whether that makes any sense.
It's a catch-22. Here's the thing. I do think that his indwelling mystery and his talking about the difficulty between bringing our rational minds and our hearts and our desire for something deeper, the water and the blood together, that I think would speak much more strongly today. I think that people yearn for something that goes beyond positivism. They yearn for something that speaks in a more deep way, and they don't want simply a reasonable approach to life. Although the smart version isn't going to discount reason. But the problem is that the book demands a classical learning. And so few people have a classical learning today. So if you're going to read it and you don't know the myth of Psyche and Cupid and Psyche, I don't think it's a bad idea to go to the appendix. It's in the appendix in some places, or the preface in others, and actually read the story. But then don't just keep going back to it as though it's sort of a Cole's notes, that's what we have in Canada, right? Not Cliff's notes, right? Don't keep going back. You'll kill the story, but just have the story in the back of your mind. But that's not all. Unfortunately, most people don't know about Stoicism. They don't know about Epicureanism. They don't have that background. So I think that in spirit, yes, it's much more congenial to today, but I think in terms of what it demands, there are very few people who have the kind of education that could read it and immediately enjoy it. You have to dig. You have to work at it. It'd make a great novel, or not a novel, a great film if somebody could do it properly, not try to mess around with it. Yes?
How close or far the theosis that Lewis is trying to deliver to his reader from the theosis that the Orthodox Church?
Very close. Lewis knew the fathers. When you read what he has said here, what he does in the Great Divorce, and his preface to Athanasius, very many places you can see that he thought that this was even his taking as the central, the grand miracle is the incarnation. It's not the death on the cross. That's important, but the taking up of humanity into God, so that we might become like God, or that we might become gods. That's incontestable to him, and so I think it's very, very close indeed. I'm not trying to say that Lewis was a covert Orthodox, but he really loved the fathers. Certainly his ecclesiology was not Orthodox, but I do think that his soteriology was.
If that's the case, then he should not wear them faces. He should take off their faces. Because in the Orthodox Church we believe there is no original sin.
Well, we don't think there's original guilt.
Right.
We don't believe that guilt is
if you
passed
say
on.
wearing faces is part of the theosis.
No, being given a face by God.
Uh-huh.
That's what he's saying. Until the time comes that we have faces, but we don't have faces yet. She wears a mask, she wears a veil all through the story. And it's only at the end that the veil can come off because God glorifies her and is happy to see what's underneath. Yes? And it doesn't happen automatically either, very much like the Orthodox tradition. She goes through the ascetic life. Yeah?
Excuse me. Lewis sometimes gets a lot of flack for kind of his portrayal of women and stuff like that, especially the Susan bit at the end of the last battle, and the bit in Mere Christianity and stuff like that. But given your presentation today of the female characters, could you speak a bit more about kind of C.S. Lewis's portrayal of women and maybe your opinion and yeah.
Oh, there's another whole lecture and I decided not to give it.
Oh, okay.
So, Lewis certainly believed in hierarchy. But I would say he'd make a distinction between hierarchy and hierarchalism. And he really did think that sometimes the hierarchies could be upset, right? And so sometimes he does have female heroic figures. Susan doesn't make it to the end of Narnia not because she's a woman. That's not the problem, right? Also, I would say in that hideous strength, Jane, whatever you make of it, there's all kinds of problems with that book, but Jane is the spiritual one. Jane is the one who rescues her husband, Mark. So he married a strong woman, right? He decided to do that against, a lot of people couldn't stand her because she was so American and brash, right? She was a very strong woman. So I don't think he was afraid of strong women. He did have a notion, though, and one has to grant this, a hierarchy, which he also says is in the Holy Trinity, not a vicious heretical hierarchy, right? But the Son doesn't beget the Father, right? The Father begets the Son, and the Spirit is not the one who spirates, but the Father is who spirates, and he makes a very clear distinction between the persons following the fathers that talked about there being really one source, but all three persons being God. and he tried to hold that together. And I think he tries to do the same in his relationship between male and female. Does he always do it? No. I really wish in that hideous strength that Jane hadn't sort of finished the story by going back and having babies, but she went really back and finished her thesis too. But as my younger daughter, my oldest daughter said, but Mom, she was a lousy scholar. I mean, that's the whole point of the story, is that she didn't like scholarship. She was only thinking she had to finish her thesis because she had to finish it. Still, it would have been a little bit more comforting to me if she'd done both. But, you know, I mean, I think the story or the report of his not understanding women and not liking women is greatly exaggerated myself.
So the book is also about love. On one hand, Orwell loves her sister, but deep down, she also discussed that she's jealous of her sister. So like he has a mixture of affection towards her sister. So can you speak a bit more about the true love in this book?
So the book to read on Lewis, to get this in not story form, but in actual essay form, would be his Four Loves. In that book, he talks about how it's very possible, especially with women, he says, and I think he's right being mother, that love, you can mistake your own need to be wanted for love, right? And Orwell wanted to be everything to Psyche. She wasn't simply thinking about Psyche's own bliss or delight, or she would have been happy for her to find her fulfillment in the house of the god, right? And she wanted to possess. At one point, she says to as she's fighting and complaining with the god, she says, "I wanted her for myself. She was mine. What right did you have to take her from me?" So it's this confusion of, we have a passion for someone, but we don't always look inside to see whether the passion is for our benefit or for theirs. And Lewis in his Four Loves talks about, I mean, he makes the Greek nouns for love probably a little bit too isolated from each other. I think there's more of a semantic range, but I think he's right that basically speaking, agape love is the word that's used to show an altruistic love, a love that looks for the other and not for oneself. So, and he's playing with that idea very strongly, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
So we'll cut the discussion there, and we'll invite Dr. John Bowen forward. I've known John, I was saying as he came in this evening, for 30 years. I'm surprised, I think, to say, because I started university 30 years ago this year. I met John at InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at the University of Ottawa. And it's not an exaggeration to say that I would not be an ordained presbyter in the Orthodox Church if it were not for John Bowen. And there's a story behind that, but I'll just leave it at that, and just to show how influential he has been in my life. He taught evangelism at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto from 1997 to 2013, and has been retired over the last year or so. And it says now in his biography, spending more time on the things he loves best, which is always good to hear: teaching, preaching, mentoring, and writing. And he did serve, before he went to Wycliffe College, for 25 years with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, or Christian Union, I think, as he would have started off in England. He did his studies at the University of Oxford, and then Trinity at Bristol, and did a Doctor of Ministry at McMaster. And it's my great pleasure to invite John forward and give us a further and up and in view of C.S. Lewis this evening.
Thank you very much.
We just have to make sure this is working first.
You may be relieved to know that my lecture is shorter than Edith's, just as my book is shorter than Edith's. And I have pictures, which for this time of the evening seems like a good idea. In this kind of gathering, I always enjoy saying that my English literature tutor at Oxford was actually the last student to be tutored by C.S. Lewis. And if you're familiar with the 3 volumes of Lewis's letters, you'll actually find some letters that he wrote to Francis Warner, my tutor for those 3 years.
John, I think it might be good if you move just a bit because your head is in the...
I'm sure there are various
Is that good for everybody?
It's further down.
Sorry?
Just a bit further.
My head?
Paraphrasing the further in.
Further in, further up, and further down. Yeah, okay, sounds good. As Geoffrey said, I've taught evangelism at Wycliffe College for many years. So although I have loved Lewis since I was a teenager, since being at Wycliffe I've looked at him particularly with an eye to seeing in what ways was he himself evangelized, and then in what ways did he himself go about being an evangelist. Edith did a very brief commercial for her book, so I'm going to do a very brief commercial and say, if you find yourself interested in this, the end of April, beginning of May, I'm doing a week-long intensive at Wycliffe College called The Evangelistic Legacy of C.S. Lewis. I'm going to stop there. So my title this evening is Looking Along and Looking At as a Key to Understanding C.S. Lewis's Evangelism. So in his diary for March the 8th, 1924, he writes this: I took Alexander's Space, Time and Deity out of the Union Library and went to Wadham College, that's a picture of Wadham College, where I sat and walked in the garden reading the introduction, greatly interested by my author's truthful antithesis of enjoyment and contemplation. Note those two words. Little did he think what far-reaching effects that reading was going to have on him. The book in question was Samuel Alexander's Gifford Lectures, and it proved to have a deep and long-lasting effect on Lewis. In fact, 30 years later, when he was writing Surprised by Joy, he wrote that Alexander flashed a new light on my whole life. That's powerful talk, right? Here's more of what he writes there. I read in Alexander's Space, Time and Deity his theory of enjoyment and contemplation. I accepted this distinction at once and have ever since regarded it as an indispensable instrument of thought. Of course, the two activities can and do alternate with great rapidity, but they are distinct and incompatible. This could be verified in daily and hourly experience. The surest way of spoiling a pleasure was to start examining your satisfaction. You enjoy something, you stop and you think, wow, I'm enjoying that a lot, and suddenly you're not enjoying it anymore. 10 years before Surprised by Joy, he had actually written a little essay which is a popularization of these two ways of looking at life, and he calls it Meditation in a Toolshed. I know that is not C.S. Lewis's toolshed, but it's the best I could find on the web. And there he contrasts contemplation and enjoyment very simply by talking about looking at and looking along. And he describes standing in his woodshed, seeing the beam of light coming in through, actually a crack at the top of the door. And at first he looks at the light and sees the dust motes dancing in the light. And then he turns and looks through the crack at the garden beyond, and then he is looking along the light. And that's how he uses it in that little essay, looking at the light and looking along the light. You may know the writer Michael Ward, famous for this book, Planet Narnia, that is a fascinating read. And he explains these two ways of coming at life. Looking along the beam of light is what Alexander called enjoyment, particular, inhabited, personal, committed knowledge. And looking at the beam of light, is what he had called contemplation, abstract, external, impersonal, uninvolved knowledge. And I think quite helpfully Michael Ward suggests that these are like the French words connaître and savoir, and you will know the difference between those two. So as he says, this shaped his whole outlook on life. One of the first places that it comes into play is in his description of his own conversion. If you know the story in Surprised by Joy, you may remember his late night conversation walking through this beautiful walk outside Magdalen College in Oxford, this late night conversation with Tolkien and Dyson. Up to that point, he had enjoyed myth, but he had looked at it. He had looked at it as a scholar, an objective observer. He had contemplated it. And even though it touched him deeply, he didn't really think of it as a thing that was true. It was just something that was interesting in an academic way. And what Tolkien and Dyson helped him understand is that myth can also be looked along. That is, it can be enjoyed. And that when one does that, instead of looking at myth academically, but looking along it, you see that in fact it is a pointer to something else, and that is the God who is the source of joy. How does this have a bearing on evangelism? You may know this name, Walter Brueggemann. I love this statement he makes about evangelism. At the heart of it is a verbal, out-loud assertion of something decisive not known until this moment of utterance. So much for those who say evangelism is what you do, not what you say. Brueggemann isn't right, and they're wrong. So much for those who say, well, we have an annual bazaar at our church, and people in the neighbourhood look forward to it coming, so it's good news for them. So I guess our jumble sale is really evangelizing them. I think Brueggemann is right, and they're wrong. Evangelism tells us something about God and Jesus and ourselves that we did not know beforehand. And this message is so radical that it calls for conversion of body, mind, and spirit in community to follow and serve Christ. It means a change of worldview, of orientation, of relationships, a change of everything. Well, how does that change come about through evangelism? Obviously, there has to be a desire for something new. That desire may be brought about on the one hand because we're dissatisfied with the status quo, we're looking for something new. On the other hand, it may be because of the irresistible attractiveness of a new possibility, a push or a pull, if you like. And either way, change on this scale requires the destabilization of our present world. We become dissatisfied with it. It's no longer reliable in the way that it was. And we're pushed into what we can call a liminal space. So what gets us into that space where things are beginning to change, they're fluid, we're confused? Well, traditionally, one way that this has happened is through apologetics. It's been, if we can call it this, an instrument of destabilization. Wow, I'd never thought of that before. On the whole, however, apologetics invites us to look at Christian faith, and doesn't, in fact, it cannot effect conversion all by itself. You may know this face, Alistair McGrath, professor at Oxford. He suggests in a book about apologetics this: apologetics is about persuading people that there is a door to another world, a door that perhaps they never realized existed. Evangelism is about helping people open that door and enter into the new world that lies beyond. I think that's a pretty good distinction. So the apologist says, in effect, try looking at Christian faith. Consider these facts about our world, these things about Jesus, and see if it makes sense. And then evangelism complements that by saying, why don't you walk through this door? In fact, this isn't in my notes, but on at least one occasion, Lewis teamed up with a more traditional apologist, a more traditional evangelist in England, Stephen Alford, and together they did a mission at Westminster Chapel, which some of you will know as where Martin Lloyd-Jones preached for many years. And first of all, Lewis got up to preach apologetically, and then Stephen Alford got up and preached in what Lewis called a heart manner. He said, I'll do the head bit, you do the heart bit. I can't do that. And there is that contrast between apologetics and evangelism in Lewis's own experience. In the world of evangelism, however, apologetics has been somewhat out of fashion for some years because it is said it sells out to Enlightenment rationalism. And instead, it's been pointed out many times that often, and if you are an adult convert, you may think of whether this is true of you, that it very seldom begins with someone being convinced of the truth of Christianity and then seeking out a church. More often it's the other way round, that people, as you may hear it being said, belong before they believe, meaning that they begin to hang out on the fringes of a Christian community. They get a taste for its authenticity. They come to believe that faith is plausible, and little by little, even unconsciously, they begin to move towards a personal faith. And others will suggest that people begin to behave before they believe. They begin to do the things that Christians do as they hang out with Christians. Perhaps they do those things with Christians, and they begin to act themselves into faith. And I think you can argue with Lewis himself that both those things were true for him, that he began to hang out with Christians. He loved them, he respected them, he learned from them. But he also began to do the sort of things that he saw his Christian friends doing. Well, it would be obvious that both these things, belonging before believing and behaving before believing, are actually forms of looking along Christian faith. The person moving towards faith is not just looking at the apologetics argument as an objective observer. They're beginning to experience the world of Christian faith relationally, behaviorally, and even emotionally. And what I want to do in this paper is look at a fourth possibility, and that is imagining before believing. And this will lead us into thinking about Lewis's fiction as an evangelistic strategy. In one way, this is a part of all evangelism, whether it's apologetics or being identified with a Christian community, being involved in Christian activity. There comes a moment when the unbeliever says, in effect, goodness, I can see how this could be true. It's the experience that Lewis describes in Miracles. There comes a moment when the children who've been playing at burglars hush suddenly. Was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, man's search for God, suddenly draw back. Supposing we really found him. We never meant it to come to that. I want to argue that what's distinctive and powerful about fiction is that it addresses primarily the imagination, not the mind or the community or the will in the first place, but directly. And I want to come at this by a slightly roundabout route by quoting what C.S. Lewis said in praise of Dorothy Sayers' translation of Dante's Divine Comedy. This is wonderful. When I'm doing my course on evangelism, we talk about translation, and I use this as an example of how translation should be. So this is Lewis describing reading Sayers' translation. I set out with the intention of judging it as a translation. But in a few cantos, I'd forgotten all about that and was thinking only of Dante. And then, a few cantos later, I forgot all about Dante and thought only about purgatory. In other words, the double mechanism, the author and the translator, worked and therefore made no noise. It is a novel form of praise to say, when asked about your share in the performance, I didn't notice it. But I think it's perhaps the highest one can give to a translation. But Dorothy Sayers, as it were, gets out of the way. And Dante even gets out of the way, so that what we experience is not, wow, what a wonderful writer they are, or I wonder why she translated it this way, but you're experiencing what it feels like to be in purgatory with Dante. So Sayers enables her readers to look along Dante's words to what it is he's pointing to. Neither of them causes, neither Dante nor Sayers causes us to stop and look at their writing. But if you like, they are windows through which one can see and, more importantly, experience the reality about which they're writing. And this, I want to argue, is the power of Lewis's fiction evangelistically. As fiction, by its very nature, invites us to enter into other people's worlds, right? To see things through other people's eyes. To see Gloam through the eyes of Oral, even if she is an unreliable narrator. We enter into relationships and experiences with the people in the fiction that we will in fact never know for ourselves. And that opens us to the possibility of change, of conversion. Look at what Susan Sontag says about literature in general, but which applies very precisely to fiction. She says, one task of literature is to formulate questions and construct counterstatements to the reigning pieties, to challenge those things, right? Literature offers not only myths, but counter-myths, just as life offers counter-experiences, experiences that confound what you thought, or felt, or believed. It can turn your life upside down through entering into someone else's world, someone else's experience. So to use Lewis's terms, a basic function of fiction is to enable us to look along the world through someone else's eyes. So fiction takes us out of our present reality into this liminal space where we can have new experiences and have at least the potential to change us before we return to think to what we think of as our real world. And I want to consider especially how this works in Narnia, although the same would apply, I think, to the Cosmic Trilogy, and I was thinking as Edith was speaking to Until We Have Faces. So here's a well-known example. Lewis doesn't tell us about Aslan as he makes us feel what it is like to relate to Aslan. So there's a scene early on in Prince Caspian, which maybe you remember, when the children are uncertain which way to go, because everything has changed since they were there hundreds of years before. One way seems easier, to go downhill rather than to go uphill. But then Aslan appears to Lucy, telling her they should go the other way, the difficult way. What's Lucy supposed to do? And when she hesitates, we feel her dilemma. We've been in a difficult spot like that ourselves. We wouldn't know what to do either. So part of us, as we're inside Lucy's head, wants to do the right thing and follow Aslan, but part of us wants to do the easier thing, as it appears at the time, the easier thing. After all, we don't want to look silly. No, I'm not sure it was really Aslan, but I think it was. We don't want to appear snobbish. No, why would he appear to you and not to the rest of us? What's so special about you? And we wouldn't want to appear uncooperative. Right? Why don't you just go along with the rest of us? We all think we should go the other way. So we read about Lucy as she wrestles with her choice, but it's the nature of fiction that we're drawn inside the mind and the heart of conscience of Lucy. We think her thoughts, we feel her feelings, we wrestle with her dilemma. And when it becomes obvious that she made the wrong choice, as we knew she would, and she knew it as well, we also feel Aslan's gentle rebuke and the force of his stern words. Remember these words, that nobody is ever told what might have been, but you can know what will be. And we also feel Aslan's gentle rebuke, and we feel the relief she feels at being given a second chance. We feel the infusion of what Lewis calls lion strength that comes as she buries her face in Aslan's mane. And we too take a deep breath when she tries to wake Peter and tell him they've got to go. We feel her relief when he says, "Certainly, Lou, whatever you like," and her frustration when he goes straight back to sleep. So you see what's happening? Without intending it and without perhaps being aware of it, we're already feeling what it is like to have, if I may dare the phrase, a relationship with Aslan. That's what it's like. We know because we are, for that time, Lucy. And there are examples of this kind everywhere in Narnia. Lewis never tells us in the Narnia Chronicles that sin is a bad thing. We don't need to be told. But we empathise with Edmund as he is seduced by the White Witch, although that works better if we happen to like Turkish delight. We're not told that to be practical is a snare and delusion, but every time Susan gives us her frequent motherly cautions, be careful, don't do that, we feel that cooling of our own enthusiasms, and so on. So the world of fiction becomes this kind of liminal space where we set aside our own mundane experiences and experience reality in quite a new way. But of course, Lewis the evangelist is not satisfied with our encountering Aslan in Narnia. He wants us to experience in the liminal space of Narnia, he wants that experience we have there to come back with us into our world so that we get to know Aslan by his other name. But how can he do that within the self-contained world of Narnia? Here it helps that what Farah Mendelssohn has called, in her article Toward a Taxonomy of Fantasy, She has suggested that Narnia is a portal quest type of fantasy. You can guess what that means. One, there is a doorway of one kind or another between our world and another one. That's how Lewis is going to help make this connection between Aslan and Jesus. That means the fictional characters can move back and forth between the two worlds. But it also means that we as readers can follow those characters from our world into the secondary world, and that things from that world can come back and enter into our world. And that's what Mendelssohn calls intrusive fantasy. So a portal through which we enter into the other world, but also an intrusive fantasy. It can come back and intrude into our mundane reality. And there are two occasions, both of them in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Lewis hints at how the realities of Narnia can enter into another world, not just the mid-20th century world of the Pevensies, but also the world of today's reader. And the fuller one is at the end, you may remember this, when the children are being forced to return to our world, and Aslan alerts them to the fact that in our world he has another name. Indeed, he says, "This was the very reason you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there." So his pointers from Narnia back to our world assume that after enjoying looking along a relationship with Aslan, we will be motivated to look for Aslan back in our world and try and figure out what his other name is here. So this is the return from this liminal experience into, quotes, normality, and finding that actually it now looks different. Or more accurately, that we are different. So those reigning pieties that Sontag talks about have been challenged. Things are not the way that we thought. Let me offer you a case study in how this works. Some years ago, I received an email from a young woman in the UK who was on a journey that would eventually lead her to Christian faith. And it turned out, as our correspondence developed, that she had been a student at Oxford, although she was there, let's just say, a long time after I was there. And she had studied math, which was unfortunate. But naturally, of course, I asked her, had she heard of C.S. Lewis? And she hadn't. She was a math student. So I recommended that she should start with the Chronicles. And she went out and bought a second-hand one volume of the stories and read them voraciously. And as our email correspondence continued, here are some of the things that she commented, and I quote these with her permission. She said, "I found the whole creation scene very moving. It's made me realize that rather than simply being created, I've been called to life for a purpose. What have I been created or designed for? Who am I meant to be?" See what's happened? She's entering into this different world. She's looking along life with Aslan, and it's making her challenge the reigning pieties, the philosophy that she has had up to this point. I've been questioning my work anyway regarding its moral validity. She worked in the gambling industry. She actually told me, I know how to fix a machine so that you will never win. She didn't tell me whether she had actually done that. She just said she knew how to do it. She says, reading about how the dwarves loved making the crowns, that's in The Magician's Nephew, right, has made me question it in another way. Where does my passion lie? What is it that I have been made to do well, as they did things well? How do logic and faith contribute to what I think is the truth? The seeing is believing, believing is seeing section in The Magician's Nephew, we had talked about this, has raised questions about my reliance on my own reason to understand or believe some things. And then this. The way Aslan accepts people and their failings has made me understand much better how God accepts us and question how I accept myself and others. She's entered into the mind and heart of Edmund as he is forgiven and restored, and it makes her think, wow, what does this mean for me? And then a very practical one. What are the things that stop me following Aslan, even though I believe in him? That was a very interesting phrase. I'd never heard her say that before. Even though I believe in him, something has shifted, like Susan and Prince Caspian. This is one I really need to work on. Well, it took several months more for Becky to commit to following Jesus, and Lewis was not her only evangelist. There were 3 significant relationships with Christians in the UK who were part of the process, and my part was primarily to be the apologist and convince her that there really was a door that was there that she needed to walk through. But the role of the Chronicles was to give her an imaginative experience of believing before she believed in reality. She believed in what Lewis calls, in describing the Chronicles, as a sort of baptism of the child's, pre-baptism of the child's imagination. And for Becky, the physical baptism came later. In teaching evangelism over the years, I've often quoted Lewis's great one-liner. He says, there are many different ways of bringing people into God's kingdom, even some ways that I especially dislike. Implying he dislikes them all, but some are worse than others. So what forms of evangelism will be effective will vary from culture to culture. In one, probably not our own, preaching will be effective. In another, apologetics. In another, rich liturgical worship. In another, charismatic signs and wonders. I actually suspect it's fairly universal that people belong before they believe and behave before they believe, which are both forms of looking along. But I want to encourage us not to neglect the power of the imagination in our evangelism, and not least the power of fiction, to create for people visions of what it is like to follow Jesus. Visions which draw them to desire and explore and embrace his reality. To paraphrase Lewis, the apologist can help someone believe that the sun has risen. But the Christian artist, and not least the Christian fiction writer, can help people see the beauty of God's world in the light of that sun, and to learn to live in that world with God, our Creator and Redeemer. Thank you.
We start with a few minutes of questions directly for John on his presentation, and then if that starts to flag a little bit, we'll open it up to more general questions for both of our speakers this evening on anything to do with Lewis.
I'll leave that picture up because it's nicer than looking at me. Shall I just call on people?
Sure.
Okay.
What was the date of your course again?
Right question.
Yeah, I like that question. I think it's Monday, April the 30th. It's the last, begins at the very end of April and then the first few days of May. It'll be on the Wycliffe website. There were some other hands over here at the back there.
How do you relate the use of story, imagination, fiction by C.S. Lewis to the use of parables by Jesus Christ himself?
Thank you. Do you know, as I was thinking about this, I thought I might get the question, so give us some examples of how that would work. And I, like you, I thought of the parables. That if we think of the prodigal son, the hearers would enter into the experience of the father, and it would be shocking. He did what when the kid came back? And maybe the young people were torn. Which of these brothers do I want to be? So I think that's a prime example of fiction drawing us into thinking about the kingdom in fresh ways. Thank you. Connie.
I had a similar, a related question actually, which has to do with St. Ignatius and his process
Yes.
of gospel contemplation.
Yes.
Could you comment on that? Did Lewis know Ignatius's work at all? You know, the spiritual exercises?
It's a really good question. I don't know. Does anyone know whether Lewis was familiar with Ignatius at all? He certainly went for a spiritual direction to Anglican nuns, so it wouldn't be surprising. But I don't know specifically. Edith?
So he doesn't mention him exactly, but he does say that he himself wouldn't find that kind of visualization to be helpful because he would spend all his time doing the creating and not enough time actually listening to God. So I think he's talking about the Ignatian exercises there, that they may be very important for, say, people. He talks about how some students in his day have like an arid wilderness of an imagination and they need it to be watered, but that's not his problem.
That was not his problem. Where does he say that, Edith? You know? What you just quoted.
The arid stuff? Or the
About
stuff
it wouldn't
before?
work for him. No.
I'm thinking letters to Malcolm, but I wouldn't
Yeah,
swear
that
to
would be
it.
the first place to look. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
I was really resonating with all you were saying because I was pre-evangelized by reading the Narnia stories as a child,
Bless you.
and eventually evangelized by reading Dorothy Sayers' translation.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. I came to Dorothy Sayers because I read her mystery novels,
Yes.
and I'd read everything else, so I just thought I may as well read Dante.
That makes perfect sense.
And in the middle of that, I had an experience of absolutely knowing it was true. But it almost got broken because when I was a child, I had a friend who said to me, well, you know Aslan's Jesus.
Oh.
And I was so dismayed. I mean, I knew the Jesus story, that went on in church, but Narnia, I believed in. My point is that, people need wise accompaniers who will make the connections gently at the point when people need to.
Yes, that's right. So my little book, The Spirituality of Narnia, is really intended for those who are not believers but love the books. And I had to be very careful not to be too heavy-handed about it, but do it in a spirit that I hoped respected the approach that Lewis himself takes to evangelism. That's a lovely story. Thank you. Yes?
Following up from the last question, certainly it's absolutely apparent to many people that this is in fact one of Lewis's aims, in evangelism. And Philip Pullman, for example, in his Dark Materials series, has said that that these stories are essentially designed to destroy that, to destroy this sort of Christian, this potential for a Christian worldview, a Christian imagination. And so I guess I would ask, how do you think one could counteract that?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, if I understood it rightly. You may know the name Philip Pullman, English young adult author. He's famous for a trilogy called His Dark Materials. The first one was made into a movie called The Golden Compass. I tried not to take too much pleasure in the fact that it didn't do very well. But he described that series explicitly as an anti-Narnia series. He's clearly a person who understands what I've been trying to say, that fiction is a way that people's imaginations and hence their wills and their characters and their choices are shaped. What was your final question? How can we counteract that? I think we need more, it would be silly to say more C.S. Lewis's, but I think we need to encourage people who are novelists and also convinced Christians not to write in a heavy-handed way, but simply to write in a way that is informed by their Christian faith. Not necessarily even intending to be evangelistic. Lewis says what we need is not more little books about Christianity, but more books by Christians in which the Christian faith is. He uses the word latent, but it's there. Think of the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. Well, Steve, what's the author's name? Covey is a Mormon, and he tells you that in the end of the book. But it infuses everything that he's saying. That's one of the more obvious examples. Are you all right with yourself? Yes?
Thank you. I was intrigued what you said about liturgy or ritual worship as being a mode of evangelism in certain cultures.
Yeah, I just put that in because of the context.
Because Lewis, in Letters to Malcolm, takes a dim view of what he calls liturgiology. And in his letter to Don B. Griffiths, who was Benedictine, founded Shantivanam in India, and practiced West Syria with the Syriac liturgy of St. James, he congratulates him on learning Syriac, but can't really understand why Don B. Griffiths is so enamored of the richness of this Eastern liturgical tradition, and by extension also his fascination with Hindu ritual and the mythology embedded in it. And then in his own practice, as I'm sure we're all aware, he avoided the sung service and preferred low mass or said Eucharist rather than sung matins. And yet, Aslan sings the world into being. So you have this, to me, a certain discrepancy between an appreciation of music and its power and the rich texture of the imagination generally that both of you outlined. And yet, when it comes to the church as a whole, he has difficulty appreciating, and it's surprising what Joy talks about too, how he's quite off-put by Anglo-Papalism and in his brief experience of that. He's off-put by all of this, and the only reprieve I see in that is when he goes on his one trip, and he goes to Greece, and he talks about loving the Orthodox liturgy because nobody had to do anything at the same time. One could stand, one could kneel, and one slithered on the floor like a snake. Presumably prostrate. I've never seen our people do that, but I've seen people prostrating. So I'm just, how do you make of this, to me, a somewhat unresolved tension between someone who, by rights, ought to appreciate the formative power of liturgy for the imagination, its generative power for cult-linked culture, and on the other hand, the facts of his life which seem to mitigate against that?
It's a lovely question. I'm going to ask Edith to help me out with that. Sorry?
Edith was one.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm dying here.
I don't want you to die, Edith. That would be bad.
So Lewis's big problem with his context was that the liturgy was being messed around with all the time, right? And I think that his discomfiture with sung Eucharist would have been the concentration upon the art rather than the use of the art as a window to God. I think it's actually very consistent with what he says later about going to Orthodox liturgy, and also what he says, by the way, about the Salvation Army, that he thinks that God's presence is most palpable in those two extremely different circumstances, because the one is the sheer joy of the Lord, and the other is forgetting oneself in a liturgy that's laid down and not performing the liturgy, but simply adoring God. So I don't think he's inconsistent at all. I think that was something very particular that was happening in his own context in Anglicanism that made him very uncomfortable with the things that he was seeing in some of the more highbrow liturgy. And so he wanted it simply to just be as plain as it could be. At one point he talks about how the best crucifix is one that is not an artistic object for him. And yet he says, I could do with any kind of liturgy if they would just stop changing it on me.
He does acknowledge that liturgical change is necessary, doesn't he?
Say again?
He doesn't acknowledge that liturgical change is necessary, but he thinks it should be at a rate...
Lengthenings, shortenings, enrichings, stretchings for the sake of the aesthetic imagination, no.
Well, he actually says he thinks changing one word per 100 years would be
there you
about the right speed of change. The reason for that actually relates to the topic of the lecture, that if there is a change, it brings you up short. You look at it.
That's right.
If the liturgy is familiar, you look along it to the God who is the object of worship. That's a very rich question. I certainly have not done it justice. Thank you. Yes.
Do you think C.S. Lewis see himself as an evangelist, preacher, winning souls for the kingdom of God?
Yes.
And can you give us examples of that?
Yes. In talking about his own prayer life, for instance, he says, I have a list of people for whose conversion I pray, and one of my main satisfactions is seeing names on that list being transferred to a list of those who are in God's kingdom and for whom I give thanks that they have made that step. That would be one example.
What about masses?
Mass evangelism? It's a really interesting question. As I say, there is this one example of him taking part in a mission with a traditional evangelist. He did the apologetics, the evangelist did the heart stuff, the altar call. I've sometimes reflected that in Surprised by Joy, he's very emphatic about he was not emotional about his conversion. He was dragged in kicking and screaming. He really didn't want to, didn't feel anything. He hated the whole thing. He wished, etc., etc. why is he so strongly about that? Surprised by Joy was written a couple of years after the first Billy Graham crusade in England. And this is pure speculation, but I do wonder, there was criticism in the press, as you might expect. Oh, this is all emotion, they keep singing Just As I Am until people break down and they go forward with lots of tears, which is so un-British anyway. But I wonder if, I think he would say there is a place for that, but he's trying to say not everyone who comes to Christian faith comes by that door. For me, he says it was an intellectual process, although that is an oversimplification, and I really didn't want to do it. There was no emotional manipulation, it was precisely the opposite. So I think there's lots more than that. Yeah, come and take the course, that would be great.
C.S. Lewis choosing the way of fiction to deliver his spirituality, theology, is it related or connected to his understanding of the human problem?
Say that again? Is his use of fiction as an evangelistic vehicle related to his understanding of
the human problem?
The human problem. The human problem being sin, alienation from God. Tell me more about what you're thinking now. What's the connection that you're making?
I think that the way your mission or your evangelism takes a shape is based on as a cure of the human problem. So if it was a misjudgment, if it is like an intellectual problem, then your mission or your way of delivery will be more educational. If you consider it more spiritual depravity, it will be more pietistic, right?
Yes, okay. I think one of the things he's doing, and I know this is not going to be a direct question, but it does bear on it, is when he is discussing the Chronicles, he says his goal was to, let me get the words right. Edith, you may need to help me, to get around the dragons. What he's envisioning is a person who maybe has been brought up in church, they have rejected it, and if anyone speaks to them about God or Christ, there are dragons which wake and breathe out fire to say, go away, leave me alone. And we know people like that. And he says one of the purposes of Narnia is to creep around the watchful dragons, that's the phrase, to enter people's imagination. So I think he sees the imagination as a way of subverting people's emotional and perhaps intellectual antagonism to the gospel. Now, as you read the fiction, you're still faced with people's sin, with people's pride. It doesn't mitigate that or reduce the importance of that, but it's a particular way of coming at it as well. That's the best I can do. I see a hand.
Do you mind?
No, not at all.
I think, too, the way the question is phrased, he might reject. I don't think he would say, I set about writing my fiction in order as a vehicle for evangelism.
Absolutely not. No.
And the reason why is because I think he thinks that all good human endeavors naturally speak of God and naturally speak of truth. In the same way as when Father blessed the waters tonight, he's showing the natural property of the water to cleanse and to heal and to do what God wants it to do for us and to even be a way in which we can see God's light. And so I think that Lewis actually does his writing, his fiction, because that's what human beings do. That's what Lewis does. He creates, he sub-creates, and in doing so, then the byproduct almost is that he glorifies God.
Yeah.
And so it's not a vehicle so much as, and it becomes a vehicle, but that's not its goal. Its goal is just to be. And by being what it is, then it leads people to God.
That's right.
But I mean, he also didn't he, write actual discursive essays and arguments and discussions of pain and love and
Yeah.
so he did the whole, he did it all, he didn't just do the imagination, he actually engaged the mind as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he specifically says, I didn't start with a list of Christian doctrines
That's right.
and then think of how I might represent that in my fiction. It was a much more organic and almost spontaneous process.
And that was the problem that I was having in trying to talk about atonement until we have faces. I just wanted to give a sense of the complexity and the depth and the beauty of the novel for its own sake,
right,
not just
right.
look at this as two examples of atonement.
Yes,
right?
thank you. Yeah. Over to you. Oh,
So C.S.
I
Lewis.
thought I was off the hook. Thanks.
C.S. Lewis wrote in the mid-20th century, and I think I've read most of C.S. Lewis, although I need to go back and reread because I read him some time ago, and my husband and I are rereading The Great Divorce. I realize how much I've forgotten. But I am wondering, I hear people like Tim Keller and a lot of people quoting C.S. Lewis, but I'm wondering how many people who are younger than me, and an earlier generation, later generation, I mean, younger people, are they reading C.S. Lewis anymore? Is he readable still? I love him, and I think probably most of us here do, but is he being read, can he be read by 12-year-olds that are in now?
It's very interesting you should say that. I mean, when I've taught this course before, I've had a lot of people in their 20s and 30s in the course who've loved it. And they come because they already love Lewis and they want to learn more. But I've tried to introduce this to my grandchildren, particularly my 11-year-old, who is an avid reader, and she just has not got into it. I think it's just one example. But as I look at the language and the wardrobe, there is so much that is English, that is mid-20th century, the reference to the Second World War. There's so much that needs to be explained. I do begin to wonder, it would be a sad thing if it stopped being read.
And then the follow-up question might be, do you think other people out there writing, not Pullman, but others, who are capturing their imagination as speaking into the 21st century for these 11, 12-year-olds?
I would be open to people giving examples. I don't know.
Madeline L'Engle, maybe.
Yes.
She gets pretty dark towards the end,
yes.
but the initial books, I mean, my grandchildren, one of them hates talking animals and doesn't like Narnia, and the other has read everything and she's 9. So it just depends on the kid. But they're only allowed to read up to a certain point, right? They can read Meet the Austins, A Wrinkle in Time, and so on, but they're not allowed to go into Many Waters and the others. You just have to stop it at some point.
And maybe those are not going to date so soon.
Maybe not.
Yeah. Any other examples of things you've found?
It's Harry Potter that grabbed a generation, and it's
Yes.
connected to the Christian story, but
Absolutely.
not nearly as explicit.
Yeah. Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you. We promised that we would wrap up before 9 so people could get home this evening, and so I'm glad to be able to keep that promise. Just 3 quick announcements here at the end. First of all, if you are intrigued by the books referenced by either of our 2 speakers this evening, if I'm not mistaken, there are still books for sale. As you go out, you'll see a table there. I believe that John Bowen's book is $10. Is that the quoting right price? And we're selling the Further Up, Further In for $35, which is the best we could do. It being published in the United States, and we got a bunch in, and that's kind of at cost anyway. Tomorrow, if you are interested in hearing more from Dr. Edith Humphrey, she has a presentation called Mixing Wine with Water, which is a metaphor she alluded to a little bit this evening. I wonder how it connects. But it's enjoyment and expectation through the style of the apocalypse, an exploration of the rhetorical, literary, and theological dimensions in chapters 11 and 12 of the Book of Revelation. This is at 3:30 p.m. at St. Michael's College at the Sheptytsky Institute, which is one of the older buildings on Elmsley Place. It's 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. tomorrow, and anyone here is welcome to join us for that. So again, tomorrow afternoon, 3:30, Mixing Wine with Water. The third announcement concerns the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius, under which we decided to offer this event this evening. As Archbishop Colin Johnson referred to the fact there used to be a chapter of the fellowship here in Toronto. It's centered around Oxford in England. It's an Anglican and Orthodox fellowship, but open to Christians of any persuasion who are interested in Christian unity and fellowship and getting together for events such as this. We are restarting, Father Philip Hobson and myself, a chapter here in Toronto. And that doesn't consist of anything other than letting us know that you are interested in events like this going forward. So if you want to be a member of the fellowship, that's a matter for going online to sobornos.org. You can find the link on the trinityorthodox.ca website where the fellowship has a page. If you need any information on that, come and see me. But the point is, membership is in the worldwide organization, which allows you then to get the journal sent to you and so forth. So there's no membership as such in a Toronto chapter, but if you would like to be informed of future events like this, let us know. I think any of you who registered through Eventbrite, you have your email address. I think probably under spam laws we're allowed to send at least one more thing to you before you tell us to go away. But if you haven't registered that way, let us know your email address and we'll email out about that. And one idea that we have is just that in a few months' time, maybe we could get back together and others of us who have been influenced or intrigued, enchanted by C.S. Lewis might want to present our own things. They may not be as scholarly or as what we heard this evening, but just how we were influenced. We can get a discussion going around that. Maybe we take a Saturday and do something like that. Father.
There are lists on the table just as you're leaving in the main hall there, where you could put your name and email address. So. Okay. It would be very helpful if you were interested in future events if you put your name and email address, or if you don't have an email address, your postal address.
Thank you very much. And thank you very... Oh, sorry, John?
Did C.S. Lewis have a direct connection with St. Sergius and St. Albans? Or
no, not that we know of. I mean, except that he hung out in some of the same places.
Yeah.
Right.
Father Jeffrey.
Yes.
I have been asked to say thank you on behalf of the sisters for the pleasure of being able to host this event.
Oh, thank you.
To say thank you to you and the members of the Murbury Fellowship, Orthodox Fellowship at Trinity, as well as to Edith and John for the amazing fellowship that we have enjoyed here tonight. It's been food for the soul, food for the body, food for the mind, food for the emotions. It's just been amazing and wonderful. And I was at probably the last meeting of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius in the 80s, I think, late 80s. And so I have had a prayer for a long time that this might get started again. So I hope you might meet here again.
Oh, we'd love to. We heard reference earlier to Bishop Henry Hill, who is much beloved of the Sisters of St. John the Divine, and really for a lot of us who are either Anglican or Orthodox, he made known to the Western and Anglican world so much of the Eastern churches, and was a tireless prayer for Christian unity. And so through his prayers we meet this evening, and I'm sure he's most delighted that the fellowship is rekindled. So.
And we also appreciated so much the service that many of you were able to attend at 6 o'clock that Vespers. It was beautiful.
Well, we hoped it represented, I mean, Edith alluded to this towards the end there, the sacramental worldview, that symbolic world that C.S. Lewis inhabits, that we live in that as Christians. And it is indeed something that pushes us into a liminal place when we celebrate that, because we should not leave liturgy untransformed, untouched. And so I hope that was a useful offering for you all this evening. So by your prayers, God be with us through his grace and love for us, always, now, and ever, and to ages of ages. Amen. God bless you all.
Safe trip home.